"You don't belong here." The new security guard's voice echoed through the empty chapel. Samuel didn't move fast enough. He was old, tired, asleep after polishing the floors until midnight. The guard didn't care. "Move now, or I'll move you." A sharp crack. Electric pain tore through Samuel's body. He collapsed near the altar, convulsing. His Bible hit the floor. The metal inside shifted slightly. 10 minutes later, while the guard scribbled notes by the pulpit, two unmarked vehicles rolled to a stop outside. No sirens, just silence and purpose. The chapel was still. Just the sound of wind slipping through the stained glass window frame. Samuel Briggs lay on the cold floor, his breath shallow, eyes barely open. The taser's charge had passed, but its echo lingered in his chest, like the aftershock of a memory he didn't ask for. His knuckles were scraped from the fall. Nearby, his Bible rested face down on the marble, open to a psalm he could no longer read. Rick Delaney, the newly hired night guard, stood at the edge of the pews, arms crossed, logbook open. He didn't look at Samuel. He just wrote, "Non-compliant individual, possible trespass, physical resistance, moderate force applied." He underlined the word moderate. In the dim light, the church looked peaceful. Rows of polished benches, brass candle holders, a quiet altar with fading lilies. None of it said crime scene. But Rick didn't see a sanctuary. He saw a man on the floor and a job to protect. Mostly, he saw his own authority reflected in his flashlight beam. Samuel slowly turned on his side, wincing. He didn't speak, didn't argue. He'd learned long ago that silence often survived longer than words. His coat was threadbare at the sleeves. His hands, weathered and careful, moved to gather the few things that had spilled from his satchel. A cloth for dusting, a ring of old keys, and the Bible. He picked it up last, gently, like it might bruise. The metal hidden inside, a service award modified decades ago with classified tech, clicked softly against the spine. Rick didn't notice. He was already pacing again, flipping through forms he barely understood. Outside, the first SUV rolled to a silent stop behind the church lot. No lights, no markings. The driver didn't exit. Samuel felt it before he saw it. A shift in the air. Something trained into his bones years ago, when stillness meant danger and noise often came too late. He looked toward the side door near the sacristy. Nothing yet, but he knew. Inside him, something steady returned. Not pride, not defiance, just presence. He sat up slowly, back against the altar. His breath steadied. For 20 years he'd worked at that church, cleaning floors no one saw, fixing hinges no one thanked him for. He was never on the payroll. The old pastor had given him the room behind the choir loft, after learning he had nowhere else to go. And Samuel had stayed, quietly, gratefully. When the pastor passed, the new board kept him, unofficially, tolerated him maybe, but never knew him. He never asked for more. He didn't think anyone owed him anything. Not for the nights in Central America. Not for what he buried there. Not for the things he still heard when he tried to sleep. But tonight, someone had crossed a line. Not with fists. With dismissal. He rubbed his shoulder, still aching, and looked at the wooden cross above. "Still here," he whispered. "Before we continue, where are you watching from today? Stories like this carry more weight when I know who's listening." I read every comment. Really. Rick Delaney circled the nave like he owned it. He walked with short, fast steps, the kind that tried to make noise feel like power. "This isn't a shelter," he said aloud, not looking at Samuel. "This is church property, not a motel." He paused, wrote another line in his logbook. Samuel didn't respond. He sat still, the taser burn on his chest still pulsing like a second heartbeat. Rick sighed dramatically and turned. "You think you can just sleep here because you mop the floors?" He waited. Samuel didn't answer. Rick stepped closer. "You're not even on the staff list. I checked. Nobody here can confirm your employment. You're not protected, old man." The words hit harder than the taser. Not because they were true, but because, in some cold way, they were. Samuel had no contract. He took no paycheck. Only the late Pastor Hargrove had ever called him family, And that man had been gone for nearly 4 years. Rick stared down at him, squinting. "You're not saying anything, huh?" "Figures. That quiet act doesn't work on me." Samuel looked up. His expression didn't change, but his eyes did. Not anger, not fear, just something deeper, a quiet refusal to play the part of a victim. "I cleaned this place," Samuel said finally, voice low. "I've cleaned it longer than you've been shaving." Rick smirked. "Is that supposed to impress me?" He clicked his pen, wrote something in tight block letters. The air in the chapel had cooled. Outside, a second black SUV rolled in near the church's side gate. Still no lights, still no movement, but the system was already in motion. Back inside, Rick pulled out his phone. "Gonna call this in. File a formal trespass notice. Might even throw in resisting directives. You know, for flair." Samuel stood slowly, leaning slightly against the pew. His knees ached, his back fought him, but he stood anyway. Rick scoffed. "Took you long enough." He walked toward the main doors, muttering, "Probably just another old drifter who thinks saying 'God bless you' earns a bed." Samuel turned and looked at the altar. He didn't speak, but he reached for the Bible on the bench beside him, held it with both hands. Inside its cover, beneath the stitched cloth, the military-modified metal remained still, but no longer dormant. 30 years earlier, Samuel had volunteered for something that didn't have a name. Jungle terrain, no uniforms, no medals, just long nights and broken missions that never made it into briefing rooms. When he came home, there was no welcome, only silence. He didn't speak of what he'd seen, not because he wasn't allowed to, but because no one wanted to hear it. The VA visit stopped after his case aged out. The medications ran out. He found a broom, a bucket, a sanctuary with a broken boiler and a good pastor, and that had been enough. Until tonight. Rick came back inside, shaking his head. No ID, no address, no witness to verify his role here. It's a clean file, honestly. You're lucky I don't press charges for squatting. He looked back at Samuel, now sitting on the edge of the last pew. Rick tapped the taser still clipped to his belt. "You ever try that again?" he said. "You won't get a warning." Samuel didn't answer. He just stared at the man, not with defiance, but with something deeper. A kind of sorrow that only the forgotten can understand. The chapel returned to quiet. Rick had stepped outside to call someone. Maybe his supervisor, maybe the police, maybe just to brag. Samuel remained seated, eyes fixed on the candle near the altar that never quite went out. He held his Bible close. His hands were steady now, even if his body was not. He could still feel the sting in his chest, where the electrodes had touched skin. But he didn't dwell on the pain. He focused on the cloth bookmark near Psalm 91, the one passage he never stopped reading. "He shall cover thee with his feathers, and under his wings shalt thou trust." He gently opened the cover. Inside, behind a folded piece of paper yellowed by time, sat a bronze medallion, no larger than a coin, nestled into a pocket sewn into the binding. It wasn't decorative, it was federal. Samuel's thumb brushed it out of habit. It clicked softly, a pulse, a whisper of metal contact, and then nothing. But that nothing was everything. Years ago, before the church, before the pain grew deeper than words, Samuel had been admitted briefly into a trauma unit under the Department of Defense, not for his physical wounds, but for the things he couldn't stop hearing at night. A quiet woman in a white coat had spoken to him then, not as a patient, as a soldier. She'd given him the medallion and said only this: "If it ever gets worse, and no one believes you're worth helping, press this. It'll know where you are." He never did. Not when the VA turned him away. Not when he lived out of his truck. Not even when Hargrove passed and he found himself cleaning the church for no money and less company. But tonight, his body did it for him. Without thought, without pride, just pain. And the system, buried deep in the Pentagon's back end, coded with old names and long classified files, woke up. Two men in dark gear sat in a parked van 3 towns over. They were part of a rotation, rarely called into action. But when the signal pinged, they moved. Across the state, an encrypted line opened on a secure channel. A call sign appeared. Nightingale Protocol, Active. Location, verified. Subject, Briggs, Samuel L. Asset status, legacy clearance, Tier 1. No questions, no hesitations. The first vehicle was dispatched within 90 seconds. The second followed with medical response. The system hadn't been used in nearly 4 years, but it had not been decommissioned, because there were still names on that list, still oaths unbroken, still debts unpaid. Back in the chapel, Samuel stood slowly. He moved with purpose now, not fast, not proud, just awake. He walked to the small supply closet near the choir loft and picked up the folded American flag Hargrove had once placed on the mantel. He brushed it off, carried it back to the altar, laid it across the table, smoothing the edges like he had done so many times before. This wasn't a show. He wasn't expecting anyone. He didn't know what the click had done, but it felt right. Somewhere outside, tires crunched gravel. The wind shifted. He didn't turn to look. He just whispered, "Not for me, for them." Rick Delaney checked his phone again. Still no response from dispatch. He muttered something under his breath and kicked a loose rock toward the church wall. The air felt heavier now, like the stillness before a summer storm. But Rick didn't notice. He was too busy rehearsing how he'd explain this situation to his boss, how he neutralized a squatter, how he prevented a breach. Then he heard it. Tires. Slow. Controlled. He turned. A matte black SUV, unmarked, coasted into the gravel lot behind the church, its headlights off. Another followed, silent and precise, parking in a reverse angle that blocked the exit. Rick squinted, confused. No local police drove cars like that. Before he could move, 4 men emerged, coordinated, unreadable, dark clothing, no badges. But the way they moved made something in Rick freeze. The lead figure, tall and lean with gray at his temples, scanned the perimeter once, then moved forward. He didn't raise his voice, didn't posture. He didn't have to. Inside the chapel, Samuel remained still, seated beside the altar, the folded flag now resting across his lap. He didn't seem surprised. The doors opened quietly. 2 men entered. One approached Samuel with a medical kit, kneeling respectfully. The other, the leader, turned to Rick, who had followed them in, demanding answers. "Identify yourselves!" Rick barked, hand drifting toward his belt. "This is private property. I need you to state your purpose." The leader looked at him, calm, measured. "Are you Rick Delaney, private security assigned to this church by Crossgate Management?" Rick hesitated. "Yeah. Who are you?" The man stepped closer. "You deployed a conducted energy weapon on a federal veteran without provocation. We have time-stamped imagery, audio signatures, and distress beacon verification." His voice didn't rise, but it carried. Every word weighed more than Rick's whole uniform. "I didn't know who he was," Rick said. "He was trespassing. He didn't follow orders." The medic beside Samuel looked up. "Subject is showing signs of acute taser exposure, elevated heart rate, muscle tremors, possible thoracic injury." He turned back to the leader. "Elderly. No immediate threat observed. Excessive force confirmed." The leader nodded, then faced Rick again. "You are not to leave this premises. You are not to touch your phone. You will be interviewed by federal representatives from the Department of Defense, the VA Inspector General's office, and likely local law enforcement." Rick swallowed hard. "Wait. Who are you people?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he tapped a device on his wrist. "Echo 1 to Watchtower. Nightingale asset recovered. Medical transport required. Local interference contained." He glanced at Samuel. "Subject appears conscious, stable. Proceeding with protocol." Rick backed toward the side door, unsure of whether to run or apologize. But 2 more figures had already entered, documenting the taser, photographing the scene, collecting Rick's logbook from where he had left it. One of them looked over and said flatly, "You spelled trespassing wrong." A new vehicle approached, this time an ambulance, sleek, unmarked, silent. Its rear doors opened as 2 responders stepped out. Samuel was gently lifted onto a stretcher. He didn't resist, didn't speak. As they wheeled him out, the team leader walked beside him. "Sergeant Briggs," he said quietly, "you're not being forgotten tonight." Samuel looked at him, truly looked. His lips moved, not quite a smile, but close. As the ambulance pulled away, the leader turned back toward Rick, now slumped on a bench. One of the federal agents handed over a clipboard with a single phrase written across the top. Preliminary charges, aggravated assault on a protected veteran. At the edge of the chapel, the American flag remained on the altar, folded, quiet, untouched. If you believe quiet dignity deserves protection, and that moments like this still matter, consider subscribing. We tell stories for those who still care. The apartment wasn't large, but it was clean, warm, and quiet. The walls had been painted soft gray. A framed flag hung above a modest wooden desk. On the windowsill sat a small ceramic dove, likely placed there by the caseworker before Samuel moved in. It had been 11 days. The VA had expedited everything. The moment Samuel's identity was confirmed through the protocol, old records long archived under restricted access, his case had been pushed to the top of every relevant list. Pension, medical coverage, housing, and something harder to process, recognition. He now lived in a secure facility reserved for high-priority veterans, the kind of place no one advertises but everyone respects. He'd been visited once, briefly, by the man who'd called himself Echo 1. No name, just a handshake, and a simple phrase before leaving, "You were never erased, just misplaced. We're correcting that now." Samuel had nodded. He didn't say much. Still didn't. His recovery was steady. The burns from the taser were healing. His ribs still ached, but it was the silence that felt different now. It wasn't empty anymore. It wasn't abandonment. It was peace. One morning, he sat by the window looking at the small courtyard garden below. An orderly brought him tea. No words, just a quiet gesture. Samuel took the cup and held it with both hands, savoring the warmth. He didn't drink yet. On the small table beside him sat a black box. Inside was the medal, cleaned, restored. Beneath it, a letter, handwritten, for services rendered, both acknowledged and unacknowledged, for sacrifices made when no one was watching, for dignity kept, even when forgotten. He closed the box gently, then reached for a folded cloth, the same one he used to wipe the church pews, edges frayed, corners soft with time. He took it in hand and stood slowly. At the edge of the room was the frame that held the American flag. He lifted it off the wall with care, set it on the desk, and began to polish the glass. Slow, deliberate strokes. Not out of ceremony, out of habit, out of memory. Each pass of the cloth felt like something sacred. Not because of the flag itself, but because of what it had endured, and what he had endured alongside it. The light outside shifted, casting soft rays across the surface. Dust floated in the air, golden and gentle. Samuel paused, then sat. He looked at the flag, then at the medal, then at nothing, and he smiled, not for the world, not for applause, just for himself. For the first time in years, the silence didn't weigh him down. It lifted him. If this story moved you, type honor in the comments. Your voice matters, and I read every single one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, here's your quiet reminder. Thank you for being here.